Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Good morning to folks here on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those in the East and Central. I want to welcome everyone to our press conference this morning on 20 years under the Patriot Act. My name is Shahid Buttar. I'm a constitutional lawyer and congressional candidate in San Francisco. And I'm going to take a minute to introduce our panel and just frame some of the issues that we'll be discussing over the course of our time together this morning. The USA Patriot Act was enacted almost 20 years ago, and the 20th anniversary will be the 26th of this month. And it began a whole series of further national security measures encompassing surveillance programs, but also others, including detention programs, torture programs, continuing patterns of secrecy. We're going to be unpacking some of that and also the impacts on communities. You'll hear from speakers including Isiah James, who is a veteran, U.S. Army veteran running for Congress in New York's 9th Congressional District. You'll hear from Sahar Aziz, who is a law professor at Rutgers, visiting professor this semester at Boston University Law School. You'll also hear from Ramesh Srinivasan, who teaches at UCLA at the intersection of computer science, engineering, public policy, ethics. Each of them have, Sahar and Ramesh in particular, have published many works addressing the intersections of these issues. And with that, I'll go ahead and invite Isiah to share a few words with us.
Again, I want to echo Shahid's thanks to everyone in all parts of the country who are tuning into this press conference to talk about something that I think for far too many Americans, it's in the back of their mind, if at all, you know, the inaction of the Patriot Act 20 years ago. I'm quoting here, but I think it was Franklin or Jefferson, can't remember who said, if you would trade security for liberty, then you deserve neither. I think that's what we are in this country. After 9/11, we were so, scared of the buzzword terrorism and all that it encapsulated that we traded our security for liberties. And we have seen that the Patriot Act has grown into this leviathan of the state that is in all arms and in all facets of our life, believe it or not. And I think that the American public, especially the newer generation, who some weren't even born when this thing was enacted, need to understand that the world that they not only are inheriting, but how to get the world in America, back to a place where we can have those freedoms and still have security. Nobody is saying that we shouldn't have security, but still have those freedoms that, are being chipped away at, piece by piece under the guise of patriotism and safety. As Shahid said, I am an Army veteran. I did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 tour in Afghanistan. I was wounded in service, and after my time in service, I became a community organizer, and I'm now the senior policy advisor for the Black Veterans Project, working to help veterans who, under the guise and auspices of the Patriot Act, were wounded in service and now are being denied those benefits that they were they so rightfully deserved when they got back home. So that's the work that I'm doing now. I'm also a congressional candidate running for Congress here in New York's 9th Congressional District. So I think that this topic is more than needed to be discussed. It's long overdue, and I look forward to a vigorous discussion and all your questions.
With that, we'd like to turn to Sahar Aziz.
Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules. This is a momentous day insofar as showing that our country, unfortunately, is not learning from the past. The past, in this case, being that we continue to sacrifice our civil liberties based on fear-mongering and based on an inflation of a threat that, while the threat exists, is not nearly, does not justify and is not commensurate with the stripping of civil liberties that came from the Patriot Act. But first, I just want to note that the past 20 years, we've witnessed in conjunction or as a result of the Patriot Act or the political environment surrounding the passage and implementation of the Patriot Act, is we've witnessed the entrenchment of Islamophobia in American society, wherein pre-9/11 Orientalism expanded to encompass not only Arabs and people from the Middle East, but also South Asian and African-American Muslims. And these otherwise diverse communities were homogenized into a terrorist other stereotype that in turn gave license to the public and the government to suspect them of being disloyal, to suspect them of being more prone to political violence, and to exclude them from American national identity and American soil, as we saw in the Muslim ban that Trump passed in 2017. In other words, Muslims were permanently dangerous outsiders, and many Americans still view that or believe in that, who deserve to be surveilled, interrogated, prosecuted, and deported as a means of protecting American national security. And in fact, the NYPD acted on these systemic biases by implementing a surveillance program that intentionally targeted tens of thousands of Muslims in the tri-state area, including Muslim students at Rutgers University, at CUNY, City University of New York, in Muslim-owned businesses and mosques. And the only reason that that program ended was because of some competent and ethical investigative journalists, right, with the Associated Press, who exposed the story and essentially revealed our worst fears that arose from the Patriot Act and then the general environment of fear based on the post-9/11 aftermath. And also members of the public, private actors, felt justified in mistreating Muslims at work, in schools, and public spaces. Some Americans, including former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, went as far as claiming that Islam was a violent political ideology and not even a bona fide religion. And so, as I examine in detail in my book, The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, whatever religious freedom rights were available in law did not apply to Muslims. And in large part, that's because they were racialized. And in our country, as our racial awakening is finally bringing to the forefront, in our country, if you are a racial minority, it is the norm, not the exception, right? To be discriminated against, to be subordinated, to be treated less than, regardless whatever rights you may have on paper. And then finally, I just want to mention that unfortunately, the agencies or the offices within federal agencies that are tasked with protecting civil rights and liberties, such as the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which I worked in during the Obama administration, unfortunately, they are also either completely inept or uninterested in being robust internal watchdogs. And so, for example, the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office does not have subpoena power to require that the other agencies within DHS or offices within DHS provide them with the data they need in order to determine if civil rights complaints alleging, for example, racial or religious profiling against Muslims in airport screening or in immigration enforcement or all of the different way, or travel no-fly lists and watch lists, if there is in fact racial and religious profiling that is occurring. And also the office does not have the ability to even tell people who complain or file a grievance through TRIP or through these other internal administrative grievance processes. They provide the complainants with no information. They just say, thank you very much. And when they provide them with a letter, they say, we've resolved it, but we can neither deny or acknowledge that there has been any violation, which of course is extremely unsatisfying and causes members of the public, particularly those who are aggrieved by DHS practices, to not have any trust in the agency. And I think one thing that's very important for a journalist is to make sure that these offices of civil rights, especially in the national security related agencies or those who have that mandate, to make sure that they actually are effective and that they're not simply political cover, right? In a way for the Secretary of Homeland Security or the Secretary or the Attorney General to essentially distract and divert credible concerns with the lack of protection of civil liberties within their agencies. And so with that, I look forward to your questions and thank you again for being here today.
Thank you for your comments, Sahar and Isiah. Our next speaker is Ramesh Srinivasan, a law professor from UCLA. Ramesh.
Fantastic to join you all, and good morning to everybody from the West Coast. I'm very honored to be with my wonderful co-panelists here. So my work really focuses on this larger question of how we restore, true democracy to the digital world, to new technology. And you might wonder what that has, what relationship that has to the Patriot Act and the Patriot Act's legacies. it's intimately connected. In fact, many of these distresses that we see today regarding Facebook, regarding other sorts of forms of disinformation, all sort of started in many senses with the passage of the Patriot Act, because at that time there was robust discussion occurring around privacy rights, around curbing some of the surveillance systems that were being enacted, not just by the state, but by private corporations. And as we all know, that has fallen by the wayside. And I think what has really occurred here, and what we have a huge opportunity to transform and overcome right now, is built upon overcoming that false distinction or that false choice that people are offered between privacy and security. Because we're not really asking the question of who is being, whose security is actually being valued, whose privacy is being valued, right? And I think that's a false distinction that was offered to us, rammed down our throats 20 years ago, and its legacies are being felt very much today. I think in general, what we really need to think about are digital rights issues in relation to the legacies of the Patriot Act that really restore trust, and care for our public, right? Our public being not just a sort of bland idea of the American public, but our citizens, especially those who are most vulnerable. Because what actually has occurred in the context of the Patriot Act, which basically opened up warrantless, essentially indiscriminate surveillance and capture of personal data of American citizens, has really been the trapdoor or the gateway to the digital economy we see today, which is more extractive than ever, where we see incredible amounts of economic inequality. That's connected to the Patriot Act. And all of these concerns that many of us have around psychographic manipulation, right? Where our data is being collected about us, our attention is being hoarded, and we're being put through these feedback loops on technology platforms of all kinds that really kind of drive us all insane and make us outraged and really polarize and take apart, just tear apart our sort of civic social fabric. So I think we have a huge opportunity right now to think about what do rights look like in a digital world, especially paying attention to those in our nation, as Sahar was just saying, who are most vulnerable, right? Because what we're seeing are various types of technological systems that were basically, kind of green lighted thanks to the passage of the Patriot Act that are harming people of color, harming immigrants, harming women. We're seeing facial recognition and AI systems, constantly showing biases that are really antithetical to what our values are supposed to be as a nation in terms of issues of civil rights. So I want to kind of talk about the Patriot Act today, or be part of this esteemed panel to think about much larger issues around how we can overcome its legacies to kind of transform ourselves into a world where the humanity of all of our citizens is respected, where the privacy of all of our citizens, especially those most vulnerable, is respected, and where we embark on a digital world where people are really humanized, people's voices, people's values, and people's power. And I really think we can get there. So I'm thrilled to be with you all today.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. Just to offer a few thoughts before we turn to attendees for questions. The arc of the last 20 years since the passage of the Patriot Act really demonstrates the collapse of our constitutional system of checks and balances. Congress enacted the law in the first place without any meaningful review of it. Many members of Congress have publicly stated since that they had not read the bill, which amounted to thousands of pages that were introduced within weeks of the 2001 attacks that were largely driven by law enforcement preceding requests that Congress had affirmatively denied. So it was effectively an authoritarian power grab from agencies, including the FBI and others that proliferated in the wake of its passage. And the DHS reorganization came a few years after. And this proliferation of agencies from NSA to FBI, components of ICE and CBP, the NCTC, I could go on, this alphabet soup of agencies dedicated to this mass surveillance mission that the Patriot Act really sort of, let out of the the cat out of a bag, as it were. And in the years since then, Congress has not only refused to return to the initial debate it never had, but even in the face of serial reports from whistleblowers, including, for instance, Edward Snowden in 2013, Congress has still largely failed to address any of the things they revealed. The USA Freedom Act, which passed in 2015, was at least a nod to the need for reform, and it expanded some transparency, but it really didn't do much to shift the underlying landscape here, especially when we consider the way in which, beyond surveillance, the national security arena also grew to encompass and embrace tactics like indefinite military detention without charge or trial, like the assassination of even US citizens without charge or trial. That happened in at least 2 cases, like torture, for which no executives have ever been held accountable. And the courts have also not been an effective check. So we've seen 20 years of unchecked, secret, unconstitutional and illegal activity in our names, using our resources to undermine our rights. And it is long overdue for there to be a reckoning. We heard from Isiah about the false choice between liberty and security. We heard from Sahar about the impacts not only on Muslim communities and the ways in which we have been racialized, taking advantage of the political agenda that the Patriot Act both announced and reinforced, but also the challenges and the limits within federal agencies of attempting to comply with any constitutional limits. Ramesh helped us grip. I love the reference to psychographic manipulation, because that is ultimately what we were talking about as the end result of all these efforts, and the importance of recognizing that the whatever distinction between public and private we might imagine that preceded the mass surveillance context has effectively been collapsed by it. The private surveillance entities like social media companies, which didn't even exist in their current formations when the Patriot Act was passed, them plus the very powerful tools available to federal agencies, including, for instance, in the PRISM program, the power to hack the companies when they don't get what the agencies don't get what they want through a legal process. There is a profound and still largely secret apparatus to monitor Americans as much as any population in the history of humankind. And the threat to human conscience, as well as our constitutional rights, is ultimately among the things that many of us aim to address. Isiah and I in particular aim to offer constitutional consciences to a Congress that seems to lack it. And we do need some changes, not just at the agency level and not just in the courts, but in Congress too. Each of the 3 branches have unfortunately grown complicit here. And I'm grateful to each of you for joining us this morning, or afternoon as the case may be, to learn a little bit about it. With that, let's turn to our journalists in attendance to see if we have any questions for our panel. Check the chat window here. Okay, first let's talk real quick, as while we're waiting for questions to come in, about the impacts of some of these national security policies on discrete communities. Last year, there was a prolific uprising around the country, particularly around police violence and the movement for Black lives. Does anybody want to share any thoughts about how the policies, starting with the Patriot Act, that have emerged in the 20 years since, have impacted that movement? Maybe we can start with Isiah and we'll
I'm glad you brought that up, Shahid, because again, in my intro, when I said that the Patriot Act is all-encompassing and it is a Leviathan that has worked its way into every aspect of society, most people might think that I'm just talking about at the federal level, but when we see how it bleeds down into the state and local level, for instance, there's a program called the 1033 program, which allows surplus military equipment to be sold to police agencies. Why is there surplus military equipment? Because we need more equipment to fight these endless wars. Why are there endless wars? Because there's money in, fighting war. So it has a trickle down effect in the negative sense, and the fact that we have militarized all of our police forces. And just like Sahar said that, we're otherized as immigrants, as minorities in this community. And Voltaire said, if you can make people believe absurdities, you can make them commit atrocities. So we're already otherized. We have all this surplus equipment. It has to be sold to these police agencies. Black and brown people are already a threat in the eyes of law enforcement. So there's just, it's a cacophony that makes a perfect storm. And we saw it boil to a head. We saw it bubble over last summer in the death of, brother George Floyd, but it has been happening all over the country. It happens under the radar all day and every day. And when somebody asks me how could we get this way, I always pose the question. You know, I'm 35, so if you remember, you know, you're old enough to understand the crack epidemic. How can a mother sell her child for crack cocaine? How could she be that addicted to something to where she would give away her child because she is addicted? How could America allow this to happen? Because we are addicted to capitalism. And there is so much money in war and terrorism and anti-terrorism that we have become addicted to it. It feeds our machine. It is literally 55% of our discretionary spending is on defense in this country. So when you have these things that come together to make this perfect storm, we have to wean ourselves off of that drug of militaristic capitalism, which funds all of these things. Because like you said, the three branches have grown separate on this issue and they're all complicit on this issue. But Shahid, you and I are both running for Congress, and the power of the purse strings originates in the Congress. And that is the most important issue, in my opinion. That's how we get the Patriot Act under control. That's how we stop Black and brown communities from being terrorized, is we have to separate the financial aspect and the monetary aspect from security. Because when you privatize security, there's always going to be an incentive to have more security.
Thank you so much, Isiah. Sahar or Ramesh, do either of you want to share anything on that theme about the impacts? Yeah.
Sure, I'll just say a couple quick comments, and I really appreciate what you just said there, Isiah. I mean, it's very, very insightful to hear your thoughts and listen to your leadership on these issues, as I've known with Shahid has really, you know, trailblazed on these issues. I don't know how many of you are aware of how, you know, you might look outside and you'll see an Amazon sort of delivery vehicle on your street. I just saw one 5 minutes ago. I don't know how often you walk around your neighborhoods and see these ring systems being set up. How many of you knew that law enforcement has made 138,000 requests for that footage? All of those vehicles have external facing cameras and internal facing cameras to monitor the biometric data of their drivers. This is an expansive data surveillance net that is being fed directly from the company Amazon to law enforcement. And this is just an example that I wanted to give to you all that almost nobody knows about. I was on NPR about a month ago discussing this with the reporter. This is what has been sort of signed into law without us even knowing. This sort of partnership, this marriage between private corporations that are part of an extractive digital economy, a surveillance capitalist economy, right? Where the surveillance and capture of our attention, our arousal, our outrage transacted through data has created the greatest economic gulf, economic inequality in the history of the world. And we see that very brutally in this country. So we also see an example like Amazon's facial recognition systems misidentifying people who are documented as undocumented, and those people being deported. They have no redressal, that's it. So these are just examples that I wanted to share with you all of how we have signed on this sort of public-private marriage that has created this environment where we, the American public, have no idea what is being collected about us, by whom, how long that data is being retained, if that data is being aggregated, which is what we saw occur with the Cambridge Analytica example, for example. And in many ways, we see sort of extensions of parts of our history that I hope, and I think many of us hope we can overcome, like COINTELPRO, right? And so that is what we're seeing occur. And I just think it's also really important for me to note that all of this is occurring largely thanks to the Patriot Act, right? Because at that time, there were robust discussions occurring in our Congress to rein in the capture of personal data and surveillance footage and content from American citizens, and all of that got just thrown out the wayside and has never come back into our discussions whatsoever. So it's not simply about Big Brother or privacy of a given individual. It's generative of all of these massive inequalities that we're seeing, and all of this lives on top, in the context of digital issues, of an internet, by the way, that all of us paid for. that the American taxpayers paid for the underlying infrastructure that has created so much inequality and so much targeting of people and their civil rights. So I think these are legacies that we have to overcome, and we have an opportunity to, marking this anniversary, to chart a new path.
Thank you, Ramesh. Sahar, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I think one thing we should keep in mind, and it somewhat echoes what Ramesh and Isiah stated, is it was no coincidence that when people within the government wanted to quash the Black Lives Matter movement, whether they were at the local police level or whether they were in the FBI, that they used the counterterrorism apparatus to criminalize protesters, criminalize people who otherwise were engaging in First Amendment protected activity. And so the term Black identity extremist was based on the term, quote unquote, Islamic extremist, which had been used as a term of art, right, for 20 years to describe people who self-identified as Muslims or claimed to act in the name of their religion in politically motivated violence. And yet, as we saw on January 6th, which was the culmination of 20 years, or at least 15 years, when Obama started to become a serious candidate, exponential rise in right-wing extremism, right, and in right-wing groups who openly supported violence and encouraged it, and yet nobody was going around calling them right-wing extremists or white extremists or Christian extremists. And I'm not to say that there was no white supremacy before 2005. Obviously, we have the long, awful history of the KKK, but there was a resurgence of it over the last 15 years. And so January 6th was no surprise to those who were paying attention to that. And clearly, either people within the FBI or within local police were not paying attention to it, or they were, but they didn't care because they saw that as protected by the Constitution, or perhaps they even ideologically supported it. And in fact, more and more journalists and civil rights groups are starting to discover that, or conduct research that shows there's actually quite a bit of sympathy and outright ideological support for white supremacy and white supremacist groups within law enforcement. Right? And these are the types of corruption and the types of governance problems that you tend to see in failed states. And so what it shows is our law enforcement is not as professional as they claim to be, right? That is a lack of professionalism. But all that is to say is that, and we've seen this we saw it in the 50s, we saw it in the 60s, we saw it in the 70s, but this is just a rehash. It's like history repeating itself of minority communities, particularly Black communities. They're always, they're the first to be targeted for any type of disagreement, any type of dissent, any type of activity to try to reform the system, is that law enforcement criminalizes them immediately. And so this is all the more reason for us to need very robust civil liberties laws and protections, and all the more reason to eliminate many of the provisions in the Patriot Act and repeal them, or if they're going to sunset, to let them sunset and not renew them. Because this is not the time when the government needs more authority. This is the time when the government needs less authority, because we've seen them abuse it over and over again.
Thank you, Sahar. I have a thought to share here that's more responsive to our next question, so I'll put that on the table. But just before I get there, you noted at the end there, you referenced the sunsets. And I just want to lay this on the table for reporters who might not be familiar with this. When the Patriot Act was enacted, due to civil liberties concerns, several of the provisions were set to expire. And on instance after instance, time after time, almost a dozen times in the last 20 years, Congress has affirmatively extended those powers without ever examining how they were used or if they were ever effective in promoting security in the face of actual attacks. This serial reauthorization, in spite of continuing secrecy, represents, again, sort of a hole in the constitutional bucket. And so that brings us to our next question. The question coming from the audience is what should Congress do and what changes can be made? So if I may take a crack at this, because it'll bridge into my concern from the prior question. When we look at the impacts on communities, the first lens through which I think people rightfully address them is through a rights-based lens, and that makes sense. When we look at the accretion of government power over the last 20 years, it's hard to overlook a power-based lens, because the power that is accreted to the government is bigger than you will notice when examining the rights abused in any discrete community. In other words, the whole is worse than the sum of its parts, and the parts are only visible to the communities that are impacted by them. The whole is only visible if you look at it from a power analysis. And government power has expanded dramatically in the last 20 years, supported by private industry. And this fusion of public and private, you might say, even if you don't look at the rights at all, as a quintessential reflection of what we in the political science literature have always correctly described and defined as fascism. Its roots have emerged in the United States in the last 20 years. The Patriot Act was a crucial vector in unleashing it. When we, Sahar is talking about at one point in her comments about the very many law enforcement agents and even public officials who've been found among the Oath Keepers database, the participation of law enforcement in the January insurrection. And we haven't noticed here, but there have been, for 17 years, FBI whistleblowers have come forward saying that the right wing has catastrophic plots to mount major attacks on energy facilities, on the water supplies of major cities. And this is not what the Bureau has been concerned about, while it has been instead contriving fake plots to ensnare Muslims to then justify its own budget increases and expansions of its investigatory authorities. So there is this very profound corruption and erosion, not just of rights, but also the constitutional framework. And ultimately, when we think about what Congress should do and can do, the question is, what can a legislature do in a democracy to fight the populism that can enable fascism? And the key, in my mind, is transparency. The very first thing that Congress's responsibility is oversight of the federal government and the executive branch. And it has failed entirely to conduct any oversight at all, let alone adequate oversight over the last 20 years. There are intelligence committees in both the House and the Senate. They were established in the 1970s because the last time anyone looked in the 1970s, they found the agency's hands in the constitutional cookie jar. Ramesh referenced COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence programs that for 50 years assaulted the rights of African-American civil rights activists, Puerto Rican independence activists, Native American activists, women seeking equal rights, people trying to stop the war in Vietnam. For decades, this was the pattern and practice of the United States government. And while the conventional wisdom is that that ended in the 70s when it was exposed by Congress and the House and the Senate intelligence committees were created, it never frankly stopped. Latin American solidarity activists faced the same treatment in the 80s. Animal rights activists in the 90s, Muslims in the 2000s, and it came full circle back in the designation of Black identity extremists to where it started. And this oppression by rotation, if there's any theme I'd want to leave you with, is the oppression by rotation is a problem, and beyond the rotation is the thing that is rotating, and that's the power. That's what Congress is here to stop, to check and balance, at least to oversee, and through legislation to ultimately dismantle. And that's what I ultimately hope to do. And I think Isiah at least shares some part of that objective, and I'd love to turn the mic maybe to him next to address the congressional question, and then we can come to Sahar and then finish with Ramesh. How's that sound?
I'm seeing a question here. Shahid says, how does the Patriot Act interface with putting people on the gang injunction list, and how easy can one find themselves on such a list? I am so glad somebody asked this question. It's from Gloria Berry at San Francisco DCCC. So Gloria, I live in New York City, and we have a thing in New York City. We had a thing called stop and frisk, where police officers could stop you and frisk you on the street, and there's a whole thing in that. I'm sad to say we have the same thing in the military. We have the system in the military called hides and bats. It's a biometric system that didn't exist before the Patriot Act in 9/11, but we did the same thing to Afghans and Iraqi military-age males who were walking down the street. We would stop them. We would take their biometric DNA, meaning their fingerprints, a swab of their saliva inside their mouth, and their retina scans. And we would put all of this information into a massive computer database. So if anything happened later, we could, find these people and link them to the crime. The same technology, again, the 1033 program, which I referenced before, has now found its hands into the police, policing at the local level. So if you're stopped on the street as a Black man or a Black woman or anybody, let's be frank, who isn't a white male, the police can easily take your biometric data without you even giving them consent and put you in the same gang injunction list. Now, imagine, just like the no-fly list, when you get on the no-fly list, it's very easy to get on. It is impossible without copious amounts of time and resources to get off of that list. It is the same thing with gangs. If you might have a tattoo that looks like something in the police's mind that it's a gang tattoo. It could be absolutely benign. But if that tattoo and your name and your data is put into that system, it is the same way with the no-fly list. It takes copious amounts of time and resources to get out of that list. And that's just one example of how easy the Patriot Act has spilled over into everyday life and how easily American citizens and non-citizens of America, just people minding their own business, living their lives, have been swept up into this thing that we don't hear about because it doesn't make the news. But it happens every day on the streets of New York. It happens every day across this country. I'm glad you asked that question. I hope I can shed some light on it to how, these things are connected.
Thank you, Isiah. Sahar?
Well, I just want to highlight the importance of journalists, because many of us so I used to be out in the trenches litigating and advocating, and oftentimes, and it's very, very difficult to get information from the government. Even when you file lawsuits, there's something called the state secrets doctrine, which effectively allows the government to hide behind national security to prevent simply the pursuit of a lawsuit, which is using the courts as a check to make sure that, in fact, these national security practices and enforcement are not merely a way to racially profile, religiously profile, say in particularly post 9/11 Muslims, and then it's been expanded significantly to other groups as well. And it was the journalists who were able to get Snowden, who ultimately became the source for Glenn Greenwald, but also the journalists in the Associated Press, the journalists in many of these other agencies who were able to do very good investigative journalism and get the whistleblowers to talk, or the ones who were not official whistleblowers but were willing to go off the record. And it's a travesty that that's the only way, or that's a significant way in which we've been able to at least attempt to hold our government accountable over the last 20 years in the face of the Patriot Act. And it's unfortunate that we haven't been able to do it as much through litigation. And also, even when you do get past the state secrets doctrine, if you are able to get to discovery, then you have judges who are very hostile to civil rights claims, and also who defer unduly to the agencies, to the federal agencies, in ways that really causes one to question whether they are, in fact, acting in their role as a check, on executive power. So national security is, unfortunately, an area of law where the courts are not as robust, or not acting and really exercising their checking role as much as they should in light of what's at stake. So I just wanted to end with that, to say that, as journalists who are in the room, I encourage you to use your important role as the fourth branch of government to prove that, in fact, laws like the Patriot Act, which I think someone mentioned was passed with only 45 days. There was no deliberation, which in and of itself warrants repealing it and then thinking through the process again to decide which part of it we should pass again or not. But it was ultimately passed in a time of crisis, and now continues to be used to, I believe, overreach and abuse executive authority.
Thank you, Sahar. Ramesh, you have anything to add here?
Just very briefly, I mean, as you all know, I'm coming at this from a privacy and surveillance sort of set of lenses. And I guess what I'd like to ask for us all to think about, and I totally agree that you all journalists are the key to really safeguarding our democracy and getting us on a better course, is what does it look like, right? What do rights look like in the context of these new technologies, this digital world, right? And what does that look like when we kind of focus on a rights-based model, a people's rights-based model toward this world as it stands? And I think what's absolutely critical when we want to think about that is that people should have complete disclosure anytime any data, personal data, is being collected about them. We should know who's collecting it and who has access to such personal data. And we, in the public interest, should have the ability to both audit and have the default be opting out of the collection of this personal data. The default in the status quo is the exact opposite of this. So instead of simply thinking about these issues solely, going at them from the Patriot Act lens only, remember, there's a great amount of discussion, a great amount of conversation, a great amount of media buzz around these problems with digital issues, right? I mean, we saw Frances Haugen and Facebook and all. Let's triangulate the problem and resolve it to think about these questions of what do rights look like in this era so we can resolve all of these issues. So disclosure of data, the retention of data, right? Sahar made some really important points, right? Should biometric data be kept for decades in databases? Who has access to those databases? How, as Isiah was pointing out, are those databases becoming mechanisms of essentially criminalizing people when you feel like doing so for your own purposes and your own benefit? For example, as Shahid was saying, the extension of various types of funding, right? More than anything, I think there should be public audit and particular, not just sort of a bland public, but those most vulnerable should be placed in positions of power over audit and discussions of whether even any of these collections, technologies of data collection should exist at all. I mean, we can all note, instead of simply thinking of this as aspirational, let's note that the city of San Francisco, right, a highly technological city, where a lot of Silicon Valley wealthy people live, including you, Shahid, not Silicon Valley wealthy, but a civil rights icon like you, right, has banned facial recognition systems. That happened in the city of San Francisco, and that's for a particular reason. So we have to recognize that as a polity, as different kinds of groups of publics, that our data is our own. It's our life energy. It's our blood, right? And that is how our own voices and our own lives and our life chances are expressed more and more. So we really should be having power over it, and the default needs to be where we provide consent in a highly transparent way, where we say, hey, we're going to give this data up to you so we can get targeted ads or get paid or what have you, right? It should be transaction specific, and that is not what's happening now. Now it's just blank check, black box. We're all just left coping in a distressed, disoriented, and polarized way, and that's why the legacies of the Patriot Act are a great, that's a great incentive amongst many others that we're seeing all around us, including on 60 Minutes, including on mainstream media every single day, to overcome these issues once and for all, an intersectional approach toward digital rights that's guided by the public interest. That's what I'm trying to fight for.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that invitation to put people at the center of the process and allowing consent, transparency, oversight with the audit trail. All of that's critically important. I want to return just to one theme that Sahar touched on in terms of the erosion of judicial review as a check constraining executive abuses. We pretend in this country that we have a justice system that is functioning. And even before the Supreme Court was stacked, let's say, with executive branch veterans and sort of right-wing ideologues, there are at least a few examples of, I think of this as why I'm ultimately running for Congress. I was a constitutional lawyer in a previous life, and I discovered that the courts effectively are co-opted, and you can see this in several different layers. Sahar mentioned the state secrets doctrine, which is a good example just to mention. It was announced by the Supreme Court in the 50s as an evidentiary doctrine in a case that was found later to be a military cover-up. And in the years since, it has expanded into a wholesale immunity doctrine. And Sahar mentioned some of the ways in which it's been used to keep executive crimes out of public review. And when it's secret, it means that Congress can't conduct oversight. It means that the courts won't review it. This is the very discrete message of the case Clapper versus Amnesty International. It was decided by the Supreme Court in the spring of 2013. It was among the things that drove a young Booz Allen staffer who had worked for the NSA and the CIA, to come forward with documents he had compiled showing that while the Supreme Court refused to examine the question presented by Amnesty International as to whether the government was monitoring its communications and its clients, the whistleblower revealed, in fact, not only is the government monitoring Amnesty International, but everybody else too. And the fact that it falls to 29-year-old employees of accounting firms to do the job that we have courts in place and Congress in place to do is frankly a shameful reflection of institutional failure. Other examples of this dynamic of the erosion of judicial review include the preponderance of prosecutors on the bench. And that's particularly embodied in the Supreme Court, where you have so many Justice Department veterans now serving with lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court. And how impartial are they when reviewing questions presented by their former colleagues? This is a structural erosion of the court's independence. And I'll just leave it at that, but it's among the reasons why we need Congress to step up and take affirmative action to guard rights and restrain power, recognizing that the other levers in the constitutional machine are either broken, absent, or co-opted. With that, I'll pause to see if we have other questions from the audience. We've got just a couple minutes left. Maybe I'll just ask panelists to wrap up with a thought. Are there any, Ramesh mentioned the reform we put in place here in San Francisco. I was proud to advocate for that limit on the ban on government use of facial recognition here in the city. Can folks point to any encouraging developments you see in other spheres or anywhere else in the country that you want to shout out or note as examples of ways that we, either the people or state legislatures or city councils, can respond to this nefarious emergence of government control through all these different mechanisms? And maybe I'll start with you, Ramesh, there, since this, I feel like this is something of your bailiwick, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actively collaborating and speaking to a number of staffers in Congress around digital rights issues within the Progressive Caucus, but not only. I think we're at a really interesting time where people across the political spectrum are, for their own reasons, including our brothers and sisters in the Republican Party, have discontent with the status quo. You know, many folks I know who identify as Republican have major problems with this indiscriminate violation of personal privacy. So there's a great opportunity for us all to come together around some of these issues. I mean, how many of you knew, for example, that we've essentially consented to algorithmic and automated systems that can make determinations about whether we are gay or not? Not only is there sort of kind of huge kind of computational problems with those determinations, as if you know, sexual identity is some sort of discrete binary kind of issue, but on top of it, look what happens. The judgments are made by these opaque systems built upon these other sorts of systems that basically allowed all our privacy to be an open book to almost anybody without us even knowing whom. And then once these judgments are made by these sorts of systems, it's too late, especially if you're vulnerable. So what I've kind of been, I have this kind of catch-all term that I use, digital Bill of Rights. I've been in contact, you know, with, as I mentioned, with several folks who want to look at the intersectional nature of our own data, not only as our property, which is what Shoshana Zuboff kind of emphasizes in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I appreciate that work, but that's a very property-based framework. I think of our digital lives and our digital worlds as basically our expression, our pathways, our life chances. So we really need to kind of, and I think that now with these, you know, spectacular failures of big tech companies that are clearly not publicly accountable and want to just kind of keep things going in-house while becoming the wealthiest companies in the history of the world, the zeitgeist is there for us to take action around digital rights issues. So there's a lot we can do. You know, I think we can think about kind of re-expressing people's lives as they could potentially be recorded or captured, obviously most perniciously, yet most sort of intimately by these phones that are in our pockets. But we re-express our lives in relation to all of these different kinds of systems and technologies of surveillance as our lives and our rights are what are foregrounded first and foremost. So there's a bunch of specific components to these ideas. I have optimism, again, that we can make some of these changes happen. And as to your important point about precedents, Shahid, I think it's important we look, for example, the New York State legislature. I was sort of peripherally involved in this. Is pushing through, the state assembly, excuse me, is pushing through various sorts of privacy rights laws. Isiah, you may be involved with all of them. I hope they could use you, your voice. I pay attention to a lot of global precedents, I'm not saying it's the be all end all, but the European Union, very centrist politicians pushed forward general data protection regulations, GDPR it's referred to. Brazil, right? A country run by a right-wing neo-fascist government does have a pretty strong privacy law. So I think we can just look at different kinds of possibilities here and start with the claim, the moral claim, the ethical claim that people's lives should be primarily, the rights over their own lives should primarily lie in their own hands. And then recognize that at scale, specific types of communities are being most violated in the status quo. So we have to think about particular types of stakeholder organizations that can lead the charge, right? So what if Black Lives Matter, for example, was in charge of making decisions about whether facial recognitions should exist, and if so, in what context? Or if there even was a determination that such systems or data collection systems should exist, that they designed those systems, right? We should be putting everybody at the table together, and we should have the real stakeholders in our society who represent our democracy on the deepest level be the ones in charge. And I think we can do it. I think we got to do it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. Any last thoughts, Sahar, before we turn to Isiah?
Yeah, as someone who's an educator, and I witness the differences, right? The generational differences of my students and maybe my generation, is I am very optimistic that they are going to demand more. I think the internet, we can have a whole separate discussion about how social media has completely changed our society, but one way is the elimination of gatekeepers in terms of who exposes, especially young people, to ideas, where it's no longer just what their teachers teach them in the classroom, or what their parents teach them at home, or what a small number of mainstream media editors decide are going to be published. And so I think that the more that we can continue to raise these concerns and show that this is not the society that you're taught that you live in, that in fact it's a very different society, and you'll only discover it when you are harmed by it. And by then it's usually too late. And so I think this movement to increase the perspectives of what Derek Bell, a famous critical race theorist, one of the founding critical race theorists, said, is listening to the voices at the bottom of the well, or the bottom of the hierarchy, is really important. Because as we do that, as we listen and as we learn about what it's like to be a Black, a Muslim, a member of the LGBTQ community, women, different identities who are not the winners in a particular system, or poor people, right? Rural people who tend to be the losers, the more that we learn from them, I think the more that, I hope anyway, that the younger generation will realize, or at least have to face the fact that what we're taught in school is not reflecting where we actually live, which country we live in. And hopefully they will at least stay committed to the ideal of what America seeks to be, and work to make it that. But I do think that the passage of the Patriot Act unfortunately set our nation back.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Isiah, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, so you asked earlier, Shahid, is there any, basically, do we see any bright spots in this bleak, blight landscape? And, we do see bright spots. In New York City, in New York State, actually, it's illegal now to use someone's immigration status, as to report them to ICE, to say, I'm going to call ICE on you because you might be a, quote, illegal immigrant in this state or city. And Ramesh asked, did we know that Amazon is using facial, recognition software actually, Ramesh, some of us, I did know that because they actually used it in New York City Housing Authority to literally get people's faces, and Amazon actually sells that data to ICE. So ICE can come into our communities to harass people, which is all part of the Patriot Act. And as we've seen throughout the pandemic, as we've seen throughout history, slavery, LGBTQ rights, you know, equal rights in marriage, disability rights, anything, government is a tool that can be used for good or bad. And with the Patriot Act, and we're talking about it now, yes, we see these bright spots along the landscape, but do we want 50 different state agency or state organizations and meaning legislatures trying to figure out this giant Rubik's Cube? No, we need government as a whole at the federal level to do that, because we see in any part of our society, when there are any rights advanced, when there's any equality put forth, when there's any type of justice levied at a macro level, it has to come from the federal government. And remember, federal government is a tool. It can be used for wrong, as we saw with the Muslim ban under Trump, or it can be used for so much good. And I want to leave it, you know, for folks to understand, especially the next generation coming up, because we're 20th century people with 20th century rules living in a 21st century world, to connect everything to what Ramesh and Sahar were saying. So we have to understand that we are on the precipice of a new decade to where we want to go in this country, and what type of a country we want to have, and what type of legacy we want to leave to our children and grandchildren, and how important, you know, it is for us to get this right. We cannot afford to get this wrong, because unlike with police violence, which we see front and center every day, unlike with, you know, discrimination of LGBTQ, which we see front and center every day, the Patriot Act is that cancer that lurks deep in the body politic, and it has metastasized to every single organ. And the only way we can truly heal is to excise that cancer, because if we leave any little bit of it, it will metastasize again, and who knows what it will mutate into the next time. So I need people, especially journalists, to understand that we have a chance to fix what we broke. We have a chance to start this next decade off right, and we have a chance to heal the wounds, the grievous wounds that we have inflicted upon so many minorities in America, and let's not forget across the world, with the 20th anniversary of this Patriot Act. We need to get this right, and it is very, very, very important that we do so, and we do not continue, or we do not stop the fight until we get to where we are going.
With that, I want to just bring this session to a close. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us. You can follow Sahar online at Sahar Aziz Law on Twitter. You can follow Ramesh at Ramesh Media. Isiah is at Isiah 4, the number 4, Congress. You can follow me at Shahid for Change. I want to also just thank each of the journalists for joining us today, and each of the volunteers and supporters who made this session possible. Isiah, I'll look forward to seeing you in Congress. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you all.